So welcome, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to this final seminar in this year's World Literature and Translation series. The series is convened by LINCS, the London Intercollegiate Network for Comparative Studies, and the Institute of Modern Languages Research at the University of London. And it's supported by a grant made from the University Convocation Trust. Over the past months, we have brought together scholars, graduate students within languages and comparative literature to consider how language and translation are at the core of any study or indeed conception of world literature today. And we've heard about some fantastic projects from colleagues working across modern languages, in postcolonial studies, environmental humanities, museum studies. And crucially, we've had several speakers who have sought to challenge and interrogate the Eurocentric scholarly discourse around world literature and translation. And today I'm really delighted to hear more along these lines, but with a project that is rooted in a series of co-produced work and workshops between academic colleagues and writers. So before I introduce our speakers today, I just wanted to let you know that the session is being recorded. So if you don't wish to be recorded, then you can keep your cameras off. The chat is open, so you can post any comments or any questions as we go along in the chat, and then I'll pick up on those at the end. The speakers today will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 45 minutes for questions for Q&A at the end. So I can invite you then to put your questions to the speakers if you post in the chat. So I'm delighted to welcome our four speakers today. Ruth Bush is Senior Lecturer in French and Comparative Literature at the University of Bristol, and her research concerns African and diasporic literary and cultural production with a particular interest in material print cultures, translation and decolonial practice. Her first book was Publishing Africa in French, Literary Institutions and Decolonizations, 1945 to 67, which came out with Liverpool University Press in 2016. And her next, Translation Imperatives, is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. She's published a history of New Beacon Books, the UK's first radical Black bookshop and publishing house, and co-produced an exhibition and digital resource about a pioneering Senegalese women's magazine, Awa, La Revue de la Femme Noire. She's currently working on two collaborative research projects, one about literary translation with Cameroonian literary collective Bakwa, and the other an ERC-funded project, The Creative Lives of African Universities, with partners in Senegal, Cameroon, Côte d'Ivoire, and Benin. And Madhu Krishnan is Professor of African, World and Comparative Literatures at the University of Bristol, where she currently serves as Director for the Centre for Black Humanities. She's author of Contemporary African Literature in English, Global Locations, Postcolonial Identifications, Writing Spatiality in West Africa, Colonial Legacies in the Anglophone-Francophone Novel, and Contingent Canons, African Literature and the Politics of Location. Madhu's currently working on a 5-year project funded by the ERC titled Literary Activism in Sub-Saharan Africa, Commons, Publics, and Networks of Practice. Shikashu Makviban is the founder of Bakwa Books and Bakwa Magazine. His fiction has appeared in Wazafiri, Kwani, Jungle Gym, and elsewhere, and his writing has been translated into Japanese, German, French, and Spanish. He's the recipient of the Académie Schloss Solitude Fellowship. Edwige René Dro is a writer, literary translator, and literary activist from Côte d'Ivoire. Her writings have been published by Bloomsbury, HarperCollins, or in magazines like Popular and This is Africa. She has judged and facilitated many writing competitions, such as the PEN International Short Story Prize, the Afro Young Adult Anthology Project, and the Bakwa Magazine Literary Translation Workshops. She strongly believes that arts and literature are the tools that can change a society for the better, and in February this year, she set up 1949, a library of women's writings from Africa and the Black world. 1949's mission is to unearth and shine light on the contributions of African and Black women to the world in order to inspire present and future generations. So I'm absolutely delighted today to welcome our 4 speakers, whose title is Translating Contemporary Writing in Cameroon, Reflections from Recent Workshops with Bakwa. And I believe, Ruth, you've got some slides to share.
I have indeed. Okay. Can everyone see the slides?
And yeah.
Yeah. They're on my browser, but hopefully that's still fine. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Joe, for that introduction, and thanks very much to the IMLR for inviting us to present in this series, and to everyone for coming along at the end of the academic year. And it's really great to also see in the room several of the people who've been involved in this project over the past few years, and I really hope you can pitch in during the discussion section of the session. Thanks in particular, of course, to Takashi and Edwige for joining us. Madio and I are going to give a kind of short introduction, and then we're going to have some dialogue with Takashi and Edwige, and hear a short reading from the anthology, which is the kind of main output of the project. So this talk today comes out of several years of collaboration that we, along with our colleague, Dr. Georgina Collins, who's also here in this session, have engaged in with Bakwa. Bakwa magazine was founded in 2011 to, in the words of its founder, Takashi McFadden, fill a lacuna and respond to the absence of spaces in Cameroon where people could at the same time publish critical and literary works. As we'll hear from Takashi shortly, its mission lies at the intersection of challenging the way content is produced and consumed by empowering writers and exploring collaborative distribution methods, what we might want to think about as a praxis-based approach to conceiving of an Africa-centred world literature. With the institution of its publishing arm, Bakwa Books, Bakwa's work has increasingly turned to the question of language and its ramifications in the Cameroonian context. So to fill in a bit of background for anyone not familiar with Cameroonian history of the 20th century, once the German colony of Cameroon, following the end of World War I, Cameroon became a UN trust territory administered under French and British mandates. The majority of the territory, about 4/5, was under French control, governed and administered along lines roughly similar to those taken in the AOF and the AF, so Afrique Occidentale Française and Afrique Équatoriale Française. While the remainder, which was called the Northern Cameroons and Southern Cameroons, were placed under British control. In the decades since their partition, the Anglophone and Francophone regions have developed along differential lines, marked by an asymmetry in resource and wealth distribution. The Anglophone areas are relatively neglected, and this has been exacerbated by the continued rule of Francophone governments since the independence of La République du Cameroun in 1960. In 1961, a plebiscite determining the fate of the British Cameroons was held, resulting in the unification of Northern Cameroons with neighbouring Nigeria and the Southern Cameroons with the French Republic of Cameroon. And this has sparked conflict between federalists, separatists, and unionists, which has continued ever since. Cameroon now has 2 official languages, English and French, alongside over 250 African languages, often referred to as national languages, and these include Iwando, Fang, and Bamoun, among many, many others. French is the main language in 8 of Cameroon's 10 regions. There's a popular saying that Cameroon is bilingual, but not Cameroonians. This is a consequence of the country's policy of official bilingualism as articulated by the former president, Ahidjo, who said that by bilingualism, we mean the practical usage of our 2 official languages, English and French, throughout the national territory. So the contemporary literary scene in Cameroon has been mediated in large part by these politics and these histories, which I've kind of really skated over in the most brief details. It's notable, for instance, that there is very little translation across languages of either Francophone or Anglophone Cameroonian writing, despite the country's rich literary and publishing history, which has been kind of quite extensively researched by scholars. The translation of work by well-known authors, including Mongo Betty, Ferdinand Doyenot and Calix Beala, has been undertaken by translators working for Global North publishing houses, in particular the Heinemann African Writers Series. I couldn't resist putting this amazing cover picture up here on the slide of for Houseboy. And more recently, North American university presses, the Global African Voices collection at Indiana University Press, and the University of Virginia's Carafe series. Where the African Writers Series provided cheap paperbacks to a primarily schools market on the African continent, the more recent growth of American series of translated African literature is embedded in the institutionalization of post-colonial studies, as well as Black and Africana studies in the North American Academy. And this is something which Viviane Steamer's book, which just came out, looks at in a lot of detail. The means of literary production, embedded in international copyright legislation established by the Berne Convention in the late 19th century, have meant that literary translators and publishers based in the global north tend to maintain ownership over publication rights for their translations. This in turn stymies the possibility of publishing new translations of African literary text by creating an imbroglio of rights issues that are only gradually being unpicked through groundbreaking collective efforts in recent years. I'm thinking here of the work of Édition Florazoa, the literary agency Pierre Astier, the work of the Terre Solidaire collection at the Alliance des Éditeurs Indépendants, as well as the work of Bakwa. As Mamadou Diarra has highlighted, intellectual property legislation is rooted in a romantic idea of authorship and does not tend to attend to the local realities of cultural production and circulation, which literary and cultural producers navigate in many parts of the African continent. And there's more that could be said there, but I'm going to hand over to Maddie at this point.
Thanks, Ruth. And especially for kind of setting some of that context. So, I think if we're thinking about the context which Ruth has just outlined, it's of no little consequence that Bakwa's own projects have attempted to engage and shape publics and networks of practice, which function quite differently, which function beyond or sometimes transversely to these market-driven and northern-centric dynamics. Amongst Bakwa's recent work, for instance, is the 2017 Short Story Prize, which worked across languages, English and French, and included a judging panel able to navigate those two languages. I should say Edwige was one of the judges, as was I. Interestingly, the results of the Short Story Prize were published as this beautiful volume of Passion and Ink, New Voices from Cameroon. And in this volume, all of the stories are presented to us in English, including those which for the Short Story Prize were originally written in French. So I think that there's something quite interesting happening there with the use of language and the idea even of troubling the sort of binary between target and source languages and these sorts of things. There's also, you'll see a photo here of the Bakwa reading series. So this was the third edition, which was held in June 2019. The Bakwa reading series operates not through the practices of official bilingualism, which, as Ruth outlined, is a practice which ultimately serves to divide and taxonomize communities as opposed to unite in relation. Rather, the Bakwa's reading series functions through an ethos that everyone in the room is part of a community and everyone can choose what language they prefer to speak in. There's no need for translation because the assumption is this is all part of a community. This is something echoed as well in Bakwa's flagship magazine, which here you can see Bakwa 10, which features contributions in both English and French, but just in the original language. They're not translated per se. And of course, as Ruth mentioned, can we get the next slide? The bilingual anthology that we all worked on together, Your Feet Will Lead You Where Your Heart Is, or Le Crépuscule des âmes sœurs, which was the result of a 2-year process of creative writing and literary translation workshops. So to connect all of this to the dynamics of translation and world literature, partaking in the type of collaborative and co-productive work that we have been outlining requires us to step away from the abstract and metaphorical uses of translation within Anglophone world literature debates. It instead encourages and requires attention to the material practice, location, and creative interpretive labor of literary translators, in view of the kind of structural inequalities that the recent polemics concerning Amanda Gorman's Dutch and Catalan translators have brought to international headlines. When we think about play with language, translation, or the lack thereof in projects such as Bakwa's, we begin to see something happening which is rather different to the simple attestation of apertures or incommensurable lacuna frameworks which so often dominate theorization around translation as it's emerged in Anglophone world literary scholarship. What we see instead are projects which, for all of their play with difference, demand a reckoning with the horizon rather more universal, not in the sense of a totality, perhaps more aptly in the sense of a tout monde, or a pluriverse, or a diversality. The philosopher Suleiman Bashir Dieng, for instance, reminds us that translation is always a play between relation and opacity, borrowing Glissant's terms, a play that tells us that the plurality of the languages of creation can hover over the horizon of a common universal language, a universal he defines as still to come, a goal, and that can only be constituted through a kind of decentering. In a country like Cameroon, for instance, the decision to translate or not, to render in multiple languages, including lingua franca, or to demand a transversal engagement with the different linguistic topographies that stack upon one another, is not merely a question of internal difference which must be overcome. The politics and aesthetics of language in a project like Bakwa's instead encompass a wholeness that is made up from the sedimented and opaque layers of difference. Competing world orders and mappings, imperial histories and world wars, language is both identity and motion, projecting itself towards a universal pluriverse yet to come, which emerges through the activity of world projection and revision, translation. Can we get the next slide, Ruth? And I think this is really encapsulated in this tweet, which is a reaction from one of the readers at that third reading series held in June 2019. So this is the French language Cameroonian writer Florian Gimbus, who was reacting to that event. And as he says, it was a super moment. I loved the unity between Francophones and Anglophones, a young and perfectly bilingual public, extending across the cleavage that's killing our country. And I just think that says something about the kind of role that language can play in a type of social production that tries to function differently than the imperial cartographies which constitute it. So what might the different models of language play in linguistic work, which we see across projects such as Bakwa's, suggest about the work of world formation and production of networks, commons, and communities through contemporary literary activism? Bakwa is very much focused on Cameroon as the center of its world-making project in various ways, using language concertedly as a means of decentering the boundaries and horizons of coloniality, which continue to shape public life in the country and indeed elsewhere. Increasingly, Bakwa's work has integrated lingua franca, such as Cam Franglais or Pidgin, for instance, and looked at the use of different media, such as podcasts through BakwaCast and WhatsApp, producing text-audio hybrids, as in a recent collaboration with the Bristol-based WhatsApp multimedia literary platform Grapevine. Beyond the larger shared project of opening platforms of creative expression and participation, what we see emerging between the kinds of work done by Bakwa is a sort of shared project of decentering and pluralizing, rooted perhaps more in a collective kind of world projection, rooted in effect and affect. This includes the affective dimensions of reading and of doing literary translations against the backdrop of conflict. Translation here is not a metaphor. So at this point, we'd like to bring in Zakashu, and he and I are going to chat for about 10 minutes or so in a little bit more detail about Bakwa, its origins, and really the way in which the work that Bakwa does uses language translation, media informed to think differently about world literature. So thanks so much for joining us, Sakashu, even though I know you're on your fellowship right now.
Thank you, Madhu and Ruth, for such a very enlightening description of the work we do. It's very interesting. Yeah, so, yeah?
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, so Bakwa emerged in 2011 to fill what I like to consider as a gap, because prior to that, there was Pala Pala, which was what I would consider as the pioneer or the most important digital magazine, Cameroonian digital magazine in English, but it also had a very Pan-African approach. So by the end of 2010, the demise of Pala Pala kind of made it much more conspicuous how much space there was, how much emptiness there was. So this led me into a couple of conversations with Kangsen from Pala Pala and a couple of other people. And because also this was a time where there were a lot of interesting initiatives and magazines on the continent, from Chimurenga to Kwani to Saraba. And we wanted to be part of this revolution. We wanted to do something that could be a place where Cameroonian writers could both put out their work and read their contemporaries. And that is very much how Bakwa magazine came into being, with the main mission of like filling this gap that existed. And over the years, this mission has very much changed, mostly to adapt to circumstances and also to respond to various issues. And right now, we're in a place where we no longer really define ourselves as filling the gap. Well, there are definitely still gaps, but there is many more interesting players right now. But we like to define our current situation as being kind of in a place where we challenge the way in which content is produced and consumed in Cameroon, because there are very few publishers in Cameroon, and that's a very generous assertion, because like it's mostly printing presses, irrespective of the language. And there's a serious lack of structures which enable the whole. There's a lack of structures which on which the writing and publishing industry or ecosystem relies on, and this absence kind of creates a lot of a lot of chaos, if I may say. So the work that Bakwa does is like to show people a different way in which things can be done, because like for example, like almost all the printing presses or publishers, or however you call them, are very much interested in producing books that are used in school, books that are on the syllabus. But we actually champion works which are much more creative, are much more experimental, are much more timeless, if I may say so, and it cuts across everything from the kind of works we commission, the kind of writers we work with, the kind of distribution models that we do, the people and institutions that we partner with, and the way in which we both conceptualize our work and produce the work that we do.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the way Bakwa's approach to language and multilingualism has evolved over the years, because I know from listening to other interviews and conversations with you that, you know, initially Bakwa was very much kind of in an Anglophone space. And of course, now it's so much bigger and wilder and more experimental even. So I was just curious about that.
Yeah, so the first two issues of Bakwa were all exclusively English, but by the time we got to the third issue, which was sometime around the end of 2012, that was our first bilingual issue, and it was in partnership with the Ofi Press magazine in Mexico, edited by Jack Little. So this partnership was such that Bakwa published young Mexican writers in published translations of young Mexican writers' works, initially written in Spanish, and these translations appeared on Bakwa O3 in English, occasionally accompanied by Spanish originals. And on the other hand, the OFI Press published West African writers in both English and Spanish. And so this was kind of like our first kind of experiments with translation. And it was well received, and it kind of like set the pace for the way in which we approach translation and language in general. And language is very peculiar to us because if you take the case of Cameroon, rather than being, say, a factor for rapprochement, it's rather a divisive factor. And yeah, it's a very utopian thing, but we don't believe that audiences should be unable to access work irrespective. So like we believe that audiences should be able to access work irrespective of the language. And we explored this question in two kind of similar yet very different ways across the projects that we do. And here I take the example of both Bakwa Magazine and Bakwa Books. With regards to Bakwa Magazine, we tend to publish works more often than not in their original languages. For example, with Bakwa Online Taxi Drivers Who Drive Us Nowhere and other travel stories, there are about 3 stories written, which are written in French and published in French, as well as 7, which are published in the original English. And so the way in which Bakwa Magazine approaches language is that we publish work in the original language in which it is written, because it's also very linked to the kind of readership that we have. We have a very multilingual readership, and it's also a way to see the way, it's also an experiment to see the way people react to these kinds of projects. And it's always interesting, like on the one hand, you'd have people who'd praise this bilingual magazine. On the other hand, you'd have people who'd complain, especially monolingual people. And then on the other hand, you'd like have people who have no idea where to place us. And it's always really interesting to see the way these things evolve. Now, on the other hand, with Bakwa Books, which is the main book publishing arm of Bakwa, we have a very much translation-focused approach. And for example, the bilingual anthology, which Matthew spoke about earlier on, is one of those projects where we try to create a space where languages, there's no hierarchy. The way we approach languages, we don't see languages in terms of hierarchies, but we see languages in terms of a flux, in terms of influencing each other and enabling each other to unlock new ways of seeing each other, which I would say are very far from the classic definition of language canonized in dictionaries or however you'd look at it. And yeah, so to come back to what I was saying, how Bakwa Magazine is very translation focused. Another book that we're currently working on is an English translation of Emile Boom's Les Jours Viennent et Passent, which comes out next year. It was originally written in French and published by Gallimard. And we acquired sub-Saharan English rights, so we're putting out an English version next year. And this is kind of this kind of marks another, not necessarily another direction, but another approach to the work that we do, wherein we're trying to decenter all these common, the usual directions in which books are published and translations go. For example, you'd have a book published in France and a translation will be commissioned in New York or London. We're trying to kind of disrupt this kind of model and show that it's very possible to have an alternative model where a book is published wherever and a translation is commissioned either in the author's home country or on the African continent or wherever. And this goes, and we even push this further by actually producing this work and sub-licensing it to the West, such that it kind of puts a kind of different and authoritative version, which at this point centers the audience that the author had in mind, if I may say so, when the author wrote the book. And of course, this is also very different from, say, if this would have been the opposite if the translation was commissioned, say, in the West, because obviously each publisher looks at a specific audience. So we are in a place where we're looking at an audience which is very African, which is very Cameroonian, which is very an audience which would at the same time relate to the book, and an audience which does not necessarily come from where the writer is, but they can still relate to the book, because like also stories are universal, and there is a way in which language can tread the fine line between being at the same time representative of what the author had in mind and what global audiences can definitely understand within different contexts.
Ruth, can we go forward 2 slides? Yes. So what you're saying, it really, when we've been talking about this before, has brought to mind this image, which is from, you mentioned Chimurenga. So this is from the October 2018 issue of Chimurenga Chronic. And I guess that I just wanted to show it to you because I really like the kind of way that it creates a sort of remapping of the world through kind of relation and flows and circulation. But I wanted to ask you then, about how you conceive then of Bakwa as kind of doing world literature in the ways that you've been describing it.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned Chimurenga, because like Chimurenga is very influential in the way, has been very influential to our worldview, and it remains very influential when we think about a lot of things. And so to come back to this map, Chimurenga has for a very long time kind of dissected this question of what does a borderless world mean? What does it mean to retrace all these routes that have been either forgotten or ignored because of like colonization and all these things? And we're very much in this we're very much in this space which is kind of inspired by the kind of Pan-Africanism which is probably inspired Chimurenga, wherein we're trying to look at networks which don't necessarily rely on Western models of distribution, because like Western models of distribution also cater essentially to the West and are very monolithic. So we're trying to look at models which are very collaborative and focus on like-minded initiatives, projects, individuals, to ensure a kind of circulation in places where our books would normally never reach if we had to rely on Western distribution. And it goes way beyond distribution. It also has to do with kind of project development, partnerships, cross cultural exchanges. And here I take the example of Limbe to Lagos, which we did in partnership with the Goethe Institute in Cameroon and Nigeria, as well as Saraba Magazine in Nigeria, where we workshopped young Cameroonian and Nigerian writers. And at the end of it, we published this collection of nonfiction called Limbe to Lagos, nonfiction from Cameroon and Nigeria. This has been a very important book for us, and I'm sure for many other people. And it was also one way for us to explore some of the models in which I have discussed. Models which are very much I would say models which are also slightly horizontal, but also beyond being horizontal, they very much rely on like-minded institutions.
Thanks so much. I'm going to pass back now to Ruth and Edwige, I guess, to talk a little bit more about the workshops which Edwige facilitated and which Sakashu organized.
Thanks, Matty. Yeah, I guess it's interesting to think about that idea of the Chimurenga idea of Pan-Africanism as flow and flux and so on, and then to bring that back to our conversation about the work of literary translators and what you do in your own work, in your own practice, Edwige, but particularly through your work in teaching literary translation and creative writing, which you've done in various different locations on the African continent. I think it's important to note that the Bakwa project, this anthology, began with 2 creative writing workshops. One of them, Edwige, facilitated in French, and the other one was facilitated by Billy Kahora in English. And then once those stories had been mentored and revised, they were the basis for the translation workshops themselves, which took place over 5 days. There were 13 participants, and we had a process of selection. There were about 50 applications. So it was really kind of rigorous selection process. And then they had 5 very intensive days of actual workshopping, and some very good food, I should mention as well. So yeah, Edwige, I guess I'd be interested to hear your kind of reflections on that workshop, and to hear a little bit more about how you teach translation.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Madhu. Thank you, Zekashu. It was great listening to you. I could have listened all day. How do I teach, creative, writing workshops and literary translation? I think the reason why even I became a literary translator was, it is connected to that idea of a borderless Africa. I hope you guys can hear me okay.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, okay. So it was about this idea of a borderless Africa. For me, language, the way we use the so-called colonial languages on this continent, for me it is very political. So in my creative writing workshop and in this literary translation workshop, I think one of the things I really focus on is voice. Obviously we'll do the technicalities like, a story arc or words or everything. But for me, it is voice. Because in our context, of Yaoundé where we were, and in a context here in Abidjan, we speak French, but we speak different Frenchies, and we're always translating or rather interpreting depending on the person whom we are speaking with. So you have the very official French with subject, verb, object. You have your popular Ivorian or Cameroonian French. Then you have your Nushi or your Camfranglais and everything. So during the literary translation, we really focused on voice. And one of the questions that I was always asking the participant was, is that how you speak? Is that how you speak? To give them that confidence of saying, okay, so when I'm writing, I do not need to write in this, in this French, in this officialese French, because this is a French that sometimes, most of the time we see, and that's why I think the work of Bakwa magazine and Bakwa books is great, because they are focusing on that French that we speak among ourselves, that we hear on the roads. They use words, Camfranglais words, pidgin words, without, putting that little asterisk and translating it at the bottom of the page, like this means that, because they assume that the people reading it will know or are really intelligent to contextualize what they are reading. So whether the creative writing workshop or the literary translation, I focus on voice. Now, what is different in the two type of workshop is that in the creative writing workshop, I think, again, this is maybe a Francophone affair, but, Francophone writers like to write to address the ills of society. So, and, writing can be very fun. And even if you're addressing the ills of society, you do not need to be very earnest about it. We can still laugh about these matters. But so in the literary translation workshop, at least when we started it, but just saw it as, translation is anyway, just replacing one word with its equivalent, in English in this particular case. And I think they were also thinking about accessibility to market, because, there is a perception, again, within many Francophone Africa that, if you write in English, things move very fast for you. You may well get very famous. But I think by the second day, by the third day of the workshop, we were moving towards, the politicalness of the language here, especially when we translated some stuff in Camfranglais, when we use the Nushi text to try and translate it into French. Because, translation, before you actually start to translate, it is a very easy process. Unless this is just me, but it is, I'm like, yeah, it can be done very easy. And then you pick up the text and you start, despite knowing the two languages or the three languages or whatever languages, you start, working, strongly with it. You start thinking, if I put this word here, what am I saying to the audience, and and things like that. So I think as the workshop went on, they realized that this wasn't a case of replacing one word with its equivalent in English. This was, a creative process, a rigorous process, a political process also.
Yeah, those political dimensions definitely came out in the workshop. I'd be interested to hear you say a little bit more about the actual activities that you asked the students to do and the kind of choice of texts that you asked them to engage with, because there was a really wide range across the workshop.
Yeah, it was a wide range, because I think I knew where I was, what was happening, and this was really a fun workshop for me too, because on the issue of voice, I think we could really exploit here, so it was. I think when I picked up this text by, Jane Austen, Emma, and I asked that they translate in Camfranglais. I think even like before then, not many of them had read Emma. It wasn't the kind of text we feel close to. But when they translated it into Camfranglais, they were like, oh, wow, this is what this is saying. And I think it was about that voice. It was about saying that this Camfranglais, it is very legitimate. It can be used as a language of translation too. Do not assume that translating into French means, going officialese. It can also mean, it can franglais. It can mean that if you have a dialogue, and in fact, during the mentoring process, one of the dialogue, and they translated it very, in a very rigid form of French. I think the first mentoring session, the text was God I beg in the original text, in a source text, and then in the translation, they translated it as Dieu s'il te plaît. And I was like, well, I do not know about you Cameroonian, but us Ivorian, we never say Dieu s'il te plaît. I mean, we just say like, Dieu, pardon, things like that. So then they were like, oh yeah, so we can. So we worked on that text, by Jane Austen into Camfranglais. We also work on because Cameroonian and Ivorian were always teasing each other. We are cousins actually. So and of course, we know of, Camfranglais, they know of Nushi because we share, the music move across borders. But then they picked up this text in Nushi that they had to translate, I think it was into Camfranglais again or into French, but it was really, really difficult for them because they know the song. This is a song they are used to and they know the words, but how can you translate to bring out that irony, that humor, all of those stuff from that, into the French in which you are translating, your work into. Oh yeah, then there was this translation by Ferdinand Oyono, and this is where no, not by Ferdinand Oyono. I don't know who did it again. But this Envy the Boy.
Was it John Reed, I think?
Yeah, exactly, John Reed. It was interesting actually when I saw that cover, because I think in a text you have something about Mangeur d'Homme, and when you see that cover and you read Mangeur d'Homme, I mean, what was John Reed trying to tell us? So that was very interesting, but I think they really saw then the political dimension, of literary translation. This is not about just replacing one word with another word. It is about what are you really doing here, and why also are you, translating. It goes beyond market. It goes beyond accessing market. For me, it's about knowing each other. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it felt like there was something very empowering about the workshop space and the kinds of dialogues and conversations that that were kind of provoked by your questions and your texts and everything, but then kind of self-generated within the group.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be, I'm aware of time, but I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on perhaps the role of mentoring in relation to literary translation and the work of literary translators more broadly, and what you think the kind of professional status of literary translators on the continent is, and what the futures might be for that work.
Listen, I enjoyed mentoring the two people that I work with, because I learned like a lot. I think, and it was a conversation between the three of us, because before Bakwa, I had never had the chance to go to Cameroon. So, most oftentimes I will ask them, is that what people say? Is that what you say? Is that, when we are translating some some stuff, especially dialogues. So it was, again, giving each of us that, those learning tools, that, empowerment also to translate, to translate in a language that we understand, not to do something, really, really dry. For the Cameroonians to recognize themselves in, but also for the Ivorians to recognize themselves in. Now, regarding the state of literary translator on a continent, we do not have, we are not so visible, because we are les figures de l'ombre, as literary translators always are. But I think it is becoming visible. Like I said earlier on, we always translate. On this continent, we are always translating, or, even when we are writing, a letter to the grandfather in a village, we are always interpreting depending on who we are speaking with. So now it is about, saying, okay, this is a viable thing. This is what we can use this for, in the same way that we want to use writing to address the ills of society. Well, we can also use translation to address the ills, that plague us on this continent. So I think, and I really have great hope that in the years to come, in a very few years to come, we will have, literary translators, African literary translators will have much more visibility, on the continent, just because our literature is so vibrant, just because there are some things that, we want to translate. I was looking at this, I was reading the preface just before this conversation, and I realized that, so, this, in Cameroon, the groundnut stew, you actually say sauce d'arachide, and in Côte d'Ivoire, we just say sauce arachide. So because we don't like articles, in this country. So our, the way in which we speak is vibrant. Our literature is vibrant. So I think, we will need literary translators to bring that, to the fore. We just need to, to shine light on them, and that will happen.
Thank you, Edwige. I'd really be interested to hear people's questions and comments. We do have an extract from the anthology as well, which it would be nice to hear. But Joe, I'm happy we could open to questions at this point. What would you prefer?
I think it would be lovely to hear an extract if you're happy to do that, and then we can go to questions. We've got until 1:30, so
okay.
A bit more time.
Okay, I think Edwige is going to read.
Okay. I am going to read a very short extract from the short story. Okay, so it is called Spital Royal. Sorry. And it is by Géraldin Mpessé. This is a translation because it was written originally in the French language as, I'm looking for the title. Do you have the title? Okay, Une bataille au crachat. Une bataille au crachat. So I am reading somewhere in the middle. This is a great story. We loved it. Okay, so I begin. The certainty of defeat loomed over the foolhardy students still standing up to the police. They watched their schoolmates writhing in pain, fractured arms, broken teeth, battered faces. I decided to head home. How could anyone continue living in this deathly place? A deathly place where grass grows brazenly, even at the entrance to the university restaurant. A restaurant where sprawling mold ate away at the walls, leaving them looking leprous. I crossed the yard as though in a waking dream, reliving scenes of these students pushing and shoving one another in queues. I would go there every afternoon and evening to feast on pieces of fish, morsels of bread, grains of rice stuck to the plate of a student who hadn't finished their food, either out of pride or lack of appetite. I relished it. God is merciful. Walking across the yard, I came upon an avocado. Whilst enjoying it, I heard a scream of agony a dozen meters away. Was that man or beast? A breeze blew, bending the shrubs. I saw a man in the bushes, dressed in khaki. He was definitely a police officer. I cleaned my lips with a lick of the tongue and rushed to respond to the scream. The police officer was strangling Awolu, our neighbor from room D14. The student could barely breathe. His eyes were bulging from their sockets. Strangely enough, not a single tear ran down his cheeks. Yet you could see from his agitation that the pain had reached its peak. The scene was awful, reminiscent of a pig singing its swan song in the hands of a butcher. My blood ran cold. The police officer let go of him. He breathed in deeply, coughing repeatedly, then tried to escape. But the officer pinned.
Oh no.
I've lost Edwige.
Takashi, would you like to continue if you've got it in front of you?
You've lost me.
Back with us, actually, Edwige, I think.
Yeah.
I got lost a moment. Am I back?
Yes, you're
Yeah, you are.
So I'll continue reading. Okay. Okay, the scene was awful, reminiscent of a pig singing its swan song in the hands of a butcher. My blood ran cold. The police officer let go of him. He breathed in deeply, coughing repeatedly, then tried to escape. But the officer pinned him against the handrail and kicked him in the back. Loser, what year are you in? Awolu stayed mute. He continued inhaling and exhaling like a dying man, awaiting the anointing of the sick. I am talking to you, idiot. Are you dumb? He barked. The student swallowed twice. I am in year 4, sir, he quivered. The police officer took a packet of cigarettes from one of his pockets while crushing the victim's thigh with his huge black boot. He pulled out a cigarette, lit it, took a drag, and several seconds later, blew thick smoke into the air. Then he produced a sachet of King Arthur whiskey from the same pocket, tore it open with his teeth, and emptied the contents in one gulp. Out of the corner of his eye, Awolu looked at him as if wanting to ask for the cigarette butt. Young man, all is fair in war. Do you hear me? Until you become a DO, an SDO, or a governor with those certificates of yours, I will discipline you. Repeat after me. It is not that hard. Let's go. A degree is no match for a first school. Repeat. Awolu cast a scornful look at the officer, who slapped him so hard that he left an imprint on a student's face. 2 trails of tears trickled down from his eyes to stagnate on his upper lip. The police officer wouldn't give up. And this is the end of this extract. And am I allowed to say it is a cat speaking?
Thank you very much, Edwige, and thank you all for such a brilliant presentation, dialogical, conversational session which is just fantastic. I'm going to open the floor right away to questions or comments or points of discussion that people would like to raise from the audience. I have lots of questions myself, but I'm going to try and kind of hold back. You can put your questions in the chat, or you could raise your digital hand, or you could just write question in the chat and we can invite you to, you should be able to unmute yourself if you have a question. Perhaps I'll start, I mean, just to get the conversation going maybe, and then, and it's a question about, I mean, thank you so much for such a really kind of stimulating session. I have a question about the workshops themselves, the kind of medium of translation and creative writing that you're using in the workshops, and the link, because you mentioned the political context and the importance of the political context, and the way in which translation, Edwige, you said translation is not just for markets, you know, we're using this in a specific, in a different way to kind of, you know, it's not instrumentalized in the way it would be for kind of marketizing texts or training people to be kind of professional translators. Translations being used, it struck me in this creative, critical way. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about the relationship between creative writing, translation, and criticality, and the ability of people to reflect or self-reflect on the political situation a bit more, given their participation in these workshops. So, I mean, it's a question to you all, but perhaps first to Edwige.
Thank you so much, Joe. You know, maybe I put my views onto them because, you know, I am quite political in the way that I do things, even if it doesn't seem like it. So maybe that, you know, fell on them. They came to be professional translators. But I think for me, it was like, you know, they have the ability to be professional translator. These are people who are translating, you know, commercially or whatever. But for me, literature, it was about giving them that confidence, the confidence of a voice. So not to translate dry text, we are engaging with creative work. And I think this is the reason why I showed them, you know, different texts. When I showed them that text translated by John Reed of Ferdinand Oyono, where it speaks of, you know, these Cameroonians being mangeurs d'hommes, and we are in Cameroon. So they are talking about them as being, you know, people eaters. How do they feel? So in their work as translator, they cannot just say, we're going to be replacing one word with another word. They need to be thinking about how this reflects, you know, on them. And when it goes out, so when that text of, you know, Cameroonian being, you know, people eaters, cannibals, when it goes out, how are other people viewing them? And when it goes out with that cover that Ruth shared earlier on, for instance, you know, how do people think about them? So it was about them themselves. Before we even think about the market, how are they engaging with those texts, you know, in front of them? You know, the texts that, you know, that comes from their own environment also, because we mentioned the text also by, what was this text? Something. Anyway, about this Cameroonian guy with Zekashu, I think you know about the Lehman Brothers, you know, collapsing.
Oh, behold the dreamers.
Behold the dreamers.
Yes.
Exactly. So, you know, all of these texts, so in, you know, for them to see, first of all, how they engage with text, how do they want to be seen? How are they being seen? Before we even talk about market, you know, and anything else like that. I don't know if I've answered the question, but maybe Madhu, you can pick it up. Or
yeah, I mean, I think like going to your question, Joe, about the kind of like relation between the creative writing process, the translation process, and criticality, there's definitely a strong connection there. But one thing I found really interesting that I think Edwige has kind of touched upon is So to be clear, so the workshops that we developed, part of why we decided to do things in Cameroon has to do with the kind of existing infrastructure and training around translation there. So in 2018, our colleague Georgina Collins did a feasibility study, which is freely available on creative writing and literary translation provision in French-speaking West Africa. So looking specifically at Senegal, at Cameroon, and at Côte d'Ivoire. And what we found through this was that there's actually quite a lot of infrastructure comparatively in Cameroon, insofar as, you know, you can study translation at the higher and advanced higher education levels. There's a ministry for bilingualism and translation. There's a robust kind of infrastructure, industry around scientific translation, because everything in the government ostensibly needs to be translated. So it's available in both languages. So that was why we wanted to begin in Cameroon, really, because the sense that came out of Georgina's feasibility study was that there was actually a lot of expertise in terms of translation, but not literary translation, right? So this kind of distinction. But I think that led to some really interesting dynamics in the workshops. And so, I mean, both Ruth and I think, kind of split our time observing the two different languages. And just to be clear, the way the workshops were organized, so Edwige was one of the facilitators, along with Georgina Collins and Raj Schwartz. And there are some kind of full group sessions, particularly in the evenings. They were kind of reading groups and discussions and debates. But then there were also smaller sessions that were specifically looking at English to French or French to English translation. So the groups were sometimes split up and sometimes brought together. And in both workshops, one thing that I noticed was this thing that Edwige was talking about, where perhaps because of the nature of professionalized translation, you know, a lot of the people, all of the participants were either students of translation or working translators. There was this kind of sense that it's not creative in the way that writing is, or the sense of, you know, you have to be correct or you have to do this. But then I think exposure to different texts and practices over the course of, you know, the 5 days did really shift that in various ways. I was really struck, for example, of a session I sat in on for the group that was translating from French into English, where the idea of italicizing and providing a glossary came up for certain terms. So things like, you know, like regional specific terms like bobolo, which is like a food stuff that's quite common in different parts of Cameroon. And just the kind of extent to which once you start sort of working through these practical decisions, the politics of it just becomes so obvious, you know, where, you know, we sort of move from this place where the conversation begins kind of with, of course you have to have a glossary so your reader knows, to sort of, well, why? We're in Cameroon. Why do I have to explain something in Cameroon to a Cameroonian audience? So I think that there was a definite kind of continuity and circuit there. I think as well, it was kind of interesting to see the choices that different of the participants in the translation workshop were making in terms of how closely they wished to work with the creative writers, because they all had the option to work with the creative writers. We gave them all the contact information. And I think there was quite a kind of diversity of decision-making there, where some of the translators worked, I think, quite a lot with the creative writers. Some of them didn't, some of them preferred to do their own thing. And I mean, maybe Zakasha would know. I don't know what kind of feedback, if any, we've gotten from the writers about their translations or the translations of their stories, what they've been thinking about them, because that could be interesting to think about as well.
Yeah, so before I get to the feedback about the translations, I also just wanted to quickly say something about creative writing, translation, and a much more critical approach. And like, so I think one of the reasons why the Bakwa workshop and other similar initiatives are really important is because more often than not, writers think that they are supposed to write or translate only in a specific way. It's as if they think they need permission to be true to the text or to be true to what they actually want to write. And that's why I think access and exposure is very crucial to this, because like, if you look at the way the writers approach their writing at the beginning of the workshop, and a similar way in which the translators approach the translation at the beginning, and the way in which both groups approached their work at the end, it was much more liberating at the end. They felt empowered. They were at a point where they felt they no longer needed permission to do justice to either the text or what they actually wanted to write. And I think this is really important because more often than not, writers or translators think that they can only write in a specific way or translate in a specific way, probably because of what they have read, which is, I don't know, like it could be easily accessible books from the West, or classic French drama or theater or fiction. So like all these things are very, all these things kind of create a sense in which writers and translators feel that they can work only within a certain way. So these kinds of access and exposure and workshops and mentoring, they actually have a liberating and empowering effect, because they make writers and translators understand that you don't need permission to translate in a way that a local audience would feel seen or would relate to it. You're not always translating for the West, but you're not just translating for the West, and there's not just one English. There are different Englishes and there are different ways in which languages evolve as well. And so yeah, to come to feedback, like a lot of the writers were really impressed, because like for I think all of them, none of their works has ever been translated. So to have their work available in a totally new language, and the prospect of like getting feedback from audiences who under normal circumstances would never have read their work, was really a life-changing, I would say, an empowering moment for that. And all the feedback I've got so far about this has been really encouraging.
Fantastic, thank you. I just wanted to bring up that there was a question in the chat around, for the mentors, around the kinds of, whether you were satisfied with the output of the translations. I mean, it struck me that you were all just picking up on that point just then in your responses, in terms of the kinds of variation that you had in the translations. I don't know if you wanted to come in on that question at all. If any of you wanted to come in on that. Conscious Ruth, you didn't speak to the last question. I don't know if you wanted to say anything else on the last one as well.
No, not on the last one. Hi Ray, thanks for the question. I wasn't a mentor, so I think Edwige would be best placed to respond to that one. I've really enjoyed reading the translations, and I've read the English and the French several times, and I find them really pleasurable to read in different ways as you experience language differently. So, as my subjective position as a reader, I think the translations are fantastic.
I was going to speak, but it is raining really heavily here, so I am worried that it might be very noisy. But as a mentor and as a workshop facilitator, I am super satisfied. Ray, this was excellent work, because I mentored Ray and Josepha, and it was excellent work, and I really enjoyed working with the mentees. The three of us really learned a lot, from the context of the countries, about, literary translation, about the difficulties also in, working with this French language that we think we know so well, but when we actually start getting to the text, it becomes really difficult. Is like, what words do we use? What French do we go for? Do we put pidgin here, or do we modify that English a bit? So no, we are happy with the translation. I am, at least.
Thank you, Edwige, and thanks, Ray, for your question. I'm conscious there's another question in the chat from Catherine. Catherine, I don't know if you wanted to unmute yourself and ask a question in live, as it were, in person, or I can ask it for you. It's a very simple question just about the translation, actually, of Hemley Boom, and Catherine's wondering if Bakwa has any intentions to publish or translate any more of her works. Shikashu?
Yeah, Emily Boom is an amazing writer, and we're very honored to be publishing her next year. And we're definitely happy to get into conversations regarding her other books, like We Are Her Home.
Thank you. Again, just inviting people to kind of raise their hands and chip in or come in on the chat. Catherine's just thanking you, Shikashu, and she's sorry she can't jump on the mic right now. I mean, perhaps I can ask a question about the visual, because you showed a slide with the visual representation of the kind of circuits, kind of reimagining, I suppose, the circuits of what is known as world literature, or what I don't know, I feel a bit uneasy about that term, and maybe that's another question I can kind of raise about the validity of using that term for what you're talking about. We're talking about this idea of the borderless world, but how are we defining that world in the first place? And I wanted to ask, I haven't had the opportunity to actually look within Bakwa magazine, but I wanted to ask about the prominence of the visual and the role of the visual as a kind of a language in and of itself, perhaps. I wondered if any of you wanted to respond to that. Perhaps I could begin with Shikashu and then move on to the others.
Could you rephrase your question? I'm not sure I understood it.
Well, I just wondered about whether we could see the visual in this representation and in other representations as a kind of language in and of itself, as an alternative way of encountering the world, of seeing the world through the format of the magazine. Does that make sense?
I see. Yeah. So to take the example of the work that the kind of network that Chimurenga and other minded magazines have established across the continent. So they have like a very self-sustained kind of network, which goes from Chimurenga in Cape Town to Cassava Republic in Nigeria to Kwani in Kenya, and it goes way beyond that to distributors like Housemans in Berlin, After 8 Books in France, and it's a very interesting network which operates like a kind of rhizome in the ways in which it kind of grows and develops momentum along the way. And it's not dictated by, say, a capitalist approach, but much more by a very Pan-Africanist approach, as well as a way to just do things differently, to do things differently and reconstitute earlier circles of distribution which existed, say, in the 70s and in the 80s, and are gradually being lost because of the way in which the publishing industry is very insipid, I would say. So it's very much in this kind of way that we like to situate the work that we do in Bakwa, like rather than trying to force ourselves into a system which is very rigid, we try to develop our own system with kind of like-minded people while making sure that our books reach the right audiences.
Thank you. Perhaps I could move on to Madhu. I don't know if you had a thought about, perhaps in particular, about the validity of that term, world literature.
I think it's a really interesting question, Joe, and I've been thinking about it, since you asked, because I think I also find the term kind of uncomfortable, just because I think that what I find difficult is how are we pinning down or defining what we mean by world literature, and it feels to be that every kind of way of defining that term runs into problems, right? So if we're thinking about it, through circulations on a world literary market, there's obviously issues there in terms of the dynamics of critical visibility, the kinds of markets that are excluded from the world literary market, the kinds of, implication with a certain hegemonic capitalist structure that is fundamentally extractive in different ways and can be quite tricky there. And I think for me, what I find uncomfortable about that definition of world literature is the way in which it strips away agency for anybody who's trying to do something different. And here, I'm thinking, for instance, of one of the events that we did in October 2019 after the translation workshops was a day-long conference that Bakwa hosted called Translation Matters in Yaoundé. And there was a session where Zakashi was talking about circulation with Bakwa books specifically. And one of the things I found super interesting from that conversation was when he was discussing, for instance, Bakwa's approach to pricing and the imperative to profit versus a kind of long-term growth of an audience and a public. And, I think one of the things he said that really stuck with me was about how they weren't necessarily in the short term turning a profit from book sales, and that they could, but then maybe Bakwa would fold 2 years later. It wouldn't be sustainable. And there are other ways of thinking. And I think the circulation-based definition of world literature often kind of pulls away the agency. Because I think, if you were thinking, say, of the World Republic of Letters or, these sorts of things, you might look at that and think, oh, peripheral is going to always be, marginalized, and you're never going to gain entry. But it's actually a deliberate choice. It's not necessarily something that is being imposed upon. And then I suppose, there's the kind of Damarash, like, greatest texts that, gain in translation. But what does that mean? And who's translating what, and who's gaining and what's losing, and who decides what a gain is. So I find that quite uncomfortable. I suppose you could think about it in the broadest sense, like literature as worlding or participating in world formation. But then to me, that's also not very satisfactory, because isn't that all literature? It becomes so big, it almost has no meaning. And I also think that, despite the fact that world literature ostensibly expands across boundaries or works at a different level, it reifies national boundaries in a way that are quite complicated. And, for example, to think about a context like in Cameroon, what does it mean to talk about the nation or the nation state? What does these things even mean? If you think about the history, if you think about the way administration functions, if you think about the way government actually functions, if you think about people's identities, if you think about language, it really complicates these ideas. You can't have a kind of Westphalian dream of the nation state. It's something that's much more complicated historically and contested. So I would agree, but at the same time, in my own work and thinking about things like Bakwa, I am interested in what would be the stakes of thinking world literature from, say, Bakwa at the center. Like, what if instead of saying, is this world literature, we just said, this is world literature, and let's think about world literature from this perspective. And I think that's where the interest comes. If instead of saying, like, world literature is a thing, but to say, I'm just going to use this as a kind of heuristic device right now, and I'm going to say, if this is world literature, this is what world literary study might mean, it can have a kind of greater critical purchase. I don't know.
Thanks, Maddie. Yeah, and certainly a kind of destabilizing effect on the kind of dominant theories, or I think dominant discourses of world literature. I don't know if anyone else wanted to come in on that question of, world literature. Sorry, Ruth, go on.
No, it's fine. I guess, similarly to Maddie, I have various critiques with different ideas circulating in world literature, to the extent where I don't feel deeply invested in it as a kind of concept to drive my own scholarship forward, or even my teaching forward. And I think, certainly when you work predominantly in Francophone contexts, where the littérature monde debates operate slightly differently to the idea of a global Anglophone world literature, it forces you to think about things slightly differently. And I think, even if we think about the case of Cameroon, where we're talking about an Anglophone minority, then that really kind of disrupts ideas of the global Anglophone hegemony in all sorts of interesting ways. I think when you bring kind of language into the world literature debate in a more kind of concerted and kind of open way, that it's kind of problematic in all sorts of ways. I know with Maddie we've talked a bit about this idea of the untranslatable and untranslatability and so on, and ultimately I think it's more interesting to think about these material contexts of retranslation and how those material contexts can shift to accommodate new translators and the work of retranslation of, African literary classics, for example, that have been, I'm not going to say poorly translated. They were translated in their time. Some of them, are problematic, but I think that there's always scope and room to retranslate texts. Viviane Stiemers, in her book that's just come out, she says every 50 years these need to be translated. But if we look at, there are 21 translations of Madame Bovary. I don't know how many translations of Proust there are. I think we need to be thinking actively about retranslation rather than going round and round the untranslatable.
I think as well, and this is kind of touching on something Zakashu said earlier, is I think one thing I'm quite interested in thinking about is not translating, right? Like this idea that, and I'm thinking about this kind of through the idea of opacity, like you have the right to not be interpreted, you have the right to not be understood, you have the right to not translate. And it's something that I found super interesting and productive in a lot of the events that I've been to that Bakwa has organized, is not translating. And, this idea, as Zakashu said, that you can get something out of engaging in a text or in a dialogue in a language, even if it's not your language. And I'm thinking here as well about things like the Afrolit Sans Frontières virtual festival, where for their last season, it was a focus on African languages. And they weren't translating, but I loved it. I don't speak isiZulu, but I loved it, right? I don't speak Hausa, but it was great. You don't need, so I think again, like just picking up on what you said, Ruth, about like how there are things that are perhaps more enriching or useful to be thinking about than untranslatability. To me, I think, you don't have to translate. There's a kind of, I think, to me, imperialism to suggesting an imperative to translate. I don't know what Zakashu thinks, though.
Yeah, it's a very interesting approach, and like I said, it's the way in which we approach things. It's kind of like it's kind of like midway between championing translation as well as saying, okay, not everything has to be translated, because we have to also trust in like the various communities that we're serving. So this is very audience specific in this case. So yeah, you also have to trust that the audience is bilingual enough or multilingual enough to just understand these things in the context. And if I'm to come back to like the fact that like it said we have to translate books like every 50 years, it kind of hints at an imbalance in the way in which translation operates around the world, because like you have books which have been translated 50 times and books which are pretty much unknown with like zero translation. And obviously there's also a very capitalist factor behind this. But yeah, it's I think it's part of a much more larger conversation that we should actively be having about how to go about translations, what not to translate, what to retranslate, and all that.
I think this feeds into, thanks Shikashu. I mean, I think this feeds into a question that Charles Badette's raising in the chat about translanguaging. And he's talking about a discussion we had recently with a colleague of ours at the Institute. He's suggesting that we should no longer be speaking about languages, but languaging or translanguaging of human experience. And he's wondering if people can comment on that. So I guess translanguaging understood as multilingual speakers using, all their languages in some kind of integrated language system, if I understand that correctly. Charles, I didn't know if you wanted to come on and say more.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, absolutely. I mean, I think in a sense the discussion has actually covered that, but I mean, it really has very strong implications of the way in which we think about what we're doing in an institute like Modern Languages or a disciplinary field like Modern Languages, where the entity of the language is so clearly reified, for want of a better word, when everything seems to be suggesting that we need to be thinking very differently about that, and we need to be talking, I think, as our colleague suggested, about languaging, translanguaging, and the fluidity that is very much part of the way in which everything that people have talked about now. So just really a reflection on the way in which it's very necessary to bring that into our own way of, indeed, even institutionalizing framing, how we talk about issues of this kind.
Thanks, Charles. And yeah, I mean, I think that's the challenge, isn't it? It's driving that into kind of institutional discussions and institutional structures. You know, the kind of the reality of multilingualism, even in a place like the UK, where this is a multilingual country, and we constantly confronted with the kind of ideological discourse of monolingualism. So that is a real challenge. I don't know if anyone wanted to comment further on that.
So I think it's a very tricky and complex question. Like, for example, if you take the case of Cameroon, for example, where a text written in English would have like segments in Pidgin and other segments in Camfranglais, and when it comes to the translation, there's so many decisions that have to be made, and these decisions are usually informed by so many things, and the more self-conscious and political the translator is, I think the better, because a safer approach, like say for example, if they're translating from English to French, a safer approach would be to translate everything into French, right? But a much more radical and political approach would be to find equivalents, because say again, in the case of Cameroon, say for example, if you're translating into French, you would have you could substitute, so you could translate the English sections into French, you could translate the Pidgin sections into Camfranglais. There's always a kind of equivalent, and I think this is very linked to audiences, and it's also something that is very reflective of the work that we've done here. And I'm to kind of turn it into a question, I'm very curious about the way in which certain people would receive it, especially in very monolingual settings, say maybe in the UK, I'm not sure, but yeah, I'm very curious about receptions about the way it's going to be received in places where people speak only a single language. To see a work, a short story written in about 3 different languages, and the translation, which matches that with 3 different languages as well. And this brings us back to the spectrum of languages and like how different Englishes play, and how the hierarchy of languages is a colonial myth. And this kind of translation puts languages on the same kind of pedestal. And I think it's very interesting to have reflections around this.
Thank you, Shikashu. I mean, that is absolutely crucial, I think. And I mean, to kind of partially respond to your question, if I may, I suppose that what would that look like in a UK context? Well, would it look like a text, a bilingual or trilingual text in Welsh, in English, in Gaelic, in Irish? And I think that would really, for me, you know, that's quite a striking image of kind of reminding people of the multilingualism of this country, but also, as you've said, of the kind of the way in which language is tied up with coloniality and power. So I don't know if anyone else wanted to comment on that, but thank you. I see Edwige says it's raining heavily, so she hasn't unmuted herself. But Edwige, I don't know if you had anything else to add. She says she's agreeing with you, Shikashu. Ruth, Maddie?
I mean, I'd be really interested to know how readers would respond to a text like that. I mean, part of the issue is publishers not wanting to take the risk, right, with multilingual texts and having a certain kind of dominant expectation of who their readers are. And I think that is changing, but that's where the role of independent publishers and the importance of bibliodiversity is really crucial, because that's where you're going to have outlets where you can have more avant-garde experimentation with language within expressive texts. I think we're quite a long way from seeing that in mainstream, literary fiction as a genre in the UK. I mean, the question made me think about Rachel Gilmore's book, Bad English, which looks a lot at multilingualism in texts published in the UK. I don't know if Maddie, you wanted to add anything?
No, not really. I think it would be something quite interesting to think about. I mean, particularly to try to think about it sort of empirically, like how people actually respond to texts in this manner. You know, because I think that in some, though not all contexts, but in some contexts which identify themselves as monolingual, any kind of multilingual expression seen as quite a threat. And I think particularly in our current political moment, we have seen this play out in different ways. But I think it would be interesting to think about like an actual text. I recently, it's downstairs, I wish I had it next to me. I just got this anthology called the Black Anthology, which has short stories and poetry and visual art from a range of different African languages. So, you know, Amharic, Somali, Kiswahili, some of which is translated, some of which isn't. So, you know, there is this sort of thing happening, but it's very much, as you say, Ruth, like at the moment, the purview of the more radical independent publishers.
I am going to jump in. I hope you guys can hear me despite the rain here. You know, I know that we're talking about the, you know, Ruth and Matthew, you mentioned the work of independent publishers. And I think that is the reason why the work that Bakwa is doing is so important, because even these multilingual texts wouldn't work in the Ivorian context here. You know, despite the 63 languages that we have, despite Nushi that we have, despite, you know, the officialist French, you need to be writing in, you know, in the French that people assume is the proper French, because, you know, again, literature is used here in a educational purpose, as opposed to, you know, well, you don't have fun with literature, basically. So yeah, again, so for me, it is, you know, I agree with what you are saying, with what Zekashu said, that, you know, you need the work of independent publishers, not printing presses, publishers who are willing to take that risk and, you know, bring that sort of work about.
Thank you, Edwige. I think we've come to half past the hour, and I think it's a great place to end, and kind of privileging the role of the independent publisher and of Bakwa in particular, and just to thank you all for such a stimulating talk and Q&A session and presentations and reading as well, which was fantastic. So just remains for me to thank our speakers, to thank the audience, and to thank our funders, the Convocation Trust, for this series. And we will be continuing this series next academic year. So keep an eye out for adverts and links to the registration. We're looking forward to seeing many of you again soon. So thank you very much.